Well, and as Henry mentioned, we've spent the last couple years studying exemplar companies, over 300 companies that we studied, and I personally interviewed over 100 CEOs. And the question we asked was, how do you create alignment in your company? And you can see the incredible diversity of companies that we studied: big companies, small companies, public companies, private companies, for-profits, nonprofits, really the whole gamut. And it was a fascinating couple of year project. And as you know, I've packaged all of those findings into my new book that's called Drive One Direction. And I'm here in the Washington, D.C. area, and there's a lot of military folks here, and the military has an acronym that I really like called BLUF. That stands for bottom line up front. And so here's the bottom line of the book. Alignment is the ultimate competitive advantage. And my hunch is that if you're on this webinar, you probably believe that to be true already. You've experienced the benefits of alignment perhaps in your company, and this is what we learned after studying all these companies. As Henry mentioned, the last webinar that I did was called Alignment 101, and you can see the link there to the Align Today website. And if you didn't have a chance to catch that, I'd encourage you to go back and invest 30 minutes of your time to learn about the foundations of alignment. We covered some things like, well, what does alignment actually mean? How do companies measure alignment? What are the financial impacts of a misalignment and therefore the benefits of improving alignment? And I think that it would be a helpful thing if you didn't have a chance to catch the last webinar, for you to go back and catch up with us. But today, what I want to talk about is what we call the 12 accelerators. After studying all these exemplar companies, the challenge was for us to package all of our findings into a comprehensive yet simple to apply methodology. And we ultimately ended up with these 12 components. And what we're going to do over the next few minutes is we're going to go through each of these 12 individually. I'm going to share with you some of the things we learned, share with you some best practices from some of the exemplar companies, and then give you a chance to contemplate your company, how you're performing in that particular vein. And as Henry mentioned, I'm going to stop periodically, and so if you have questions as we're going through, I'd love for this to be as interactive as possible and as helpful to you and practical as we possibly can make it. So with that, let's talk about accelerator number one. We call this One Team. And here's what we learned. A misaligned executive team will never create an aligned company. So alignment starts at the top. One of the CEOs we talked to was a gentleman by the name of Randy Papadelis. Randy is the former chief executive of Ocean Spray Cranberry. And he described his role as the CEO as the chief alignment officer. And I really like that idea. We encourage all of the CEOs to become the chief alignment officer for their company. But it extends to the rest of the executive team for sure, and the management team. And the more aligned they are, the better. So one of the CEOs I had the distinct privilege of interviewing was Alan Mulally, the now retired CEO of Ford. And when Alan took over as the CEO of Ford in 2008, perhaps you remember that many of the car companies were struggling financially, taking government bailouts, et cetera. But Alan came to Ford with a transformation agenda that he called One Ford. And it starts with one team. And he described the process of coming into Ford, which was at the time very fragmented. There were a lot of fiefdoms and infighting among the management team. And he went through the process of creating aligned and unified management team, and then creating alignment with all of their key stakeholders: employees, dealers, investors, suppliers, the unions, etc. And you can see this little card here that I have as the PowerPoint slide was actually printed on the back of his business cards that he handed out to try to transform Ford. And in fact, the One Ford plan worked. over the time of Mullally's tenure there. The stock price rebounded and more than doubled. And it was really an amazing, amazing success story that landed Mr. Mullally in the Business Hall of Fame. So let's think about your company. We call these checkpoints, and you'll see at the end of every one of our little accelerators, we're going to ask you some questions. So I ask you, how's your team function? Does your CEO work as the Chief Alignment Officer? Is your executive team working as one team? Because again, a misaligned executive team will never create an aligned company. It starts at the top. Accelerator number 2 is what we call one thing. One thing. About 6 years ago, I wrote a book called Decide One Thing. And this is the summary. You must be good at lots of things, but the way to win is to become differentiatingly great at one thing. At one thing. And what we learned is that many of the exemplar companies, in fact, found their one thing and used that to create alignment. For example, Dyson. Dyson's one thing is engineering. And if you go to the Dyson website, what you'll learn is that they say, here's how they say it. Not everybody at Dyson is an engineer, but we encourage everyone to think like one. And so Dyson knows that the source of their differentiating competitive advantage is engineering. That doesn't mean that marketing's not important or manufacturing's not important or HR is not important or all the other disciplines aren't important. But they had the wisdom to choose one thing, in their case, engineering, make that the main thing, and then use that to create alignment. Ferrari, another great example. Ferrari's one thing is racing. Racing is in their DNA. It's been in their DNA from the beginning. And in fact, Ferrari invests 15% of revenue in their Formula One racing program. 15% of revenue. And so as we say, if you invest 15% of revenue in one thing, well, that's your one thing. And that's what it is for Ferrari, racing. Herman Miller is another very interesting example. At Herman Miller, their one thing is design. When you go to their website, you'll see that they have pictures featured of famous designers, such as Ray and Charles Eames in this picture, the designer of the famous Eames chair and Eames lounge. And so at Herman Miller, they say it very similar to Dyson. What they say is that at Herman Miller, you don't have to be a designer to make the world a better place. And we encourage everyone to think like a designer. Herman Miller, design is their one thing. And so how about your company? Can you complete this sentence? We're good at lots of things, but we're differentiatingly great at engineering or racing or design or sales or quality. But you can see how the exemplar companies, they found their one thing and then they use that to create alignment because everybody knows that's what it is and they invest disproportionately in it. And so, Henry, perhaps I'll stop and check in with you and see if we have any questions coming in on the chat on the first two of the accelerators.
Nothing yet, Dave.
Okay. Well, let me make this offer to all of you. If you are struggling with identifying your company's one thing, drop me a line with your mailing address to Dave at ShiftPoints, and I'll send you a copy of my first book, Decide One Thing. And we include it at this point in the book and in this point in the presentation because we feel that it's absolutely essential for companies to get this right. You really can't write a vision statement unless you know what your one thing is, which leads me to our next accelerator, one vision. What we learned is that, number one, it's incredibly important for companies to have a vision, but there are many ways to articulate one. And this was fascinating as we studied all these companies and looked at their visions and their vision statements. For example, Virgin Hyperloop One is a great example of the visionary vision. So Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX fame got extremely frustrated with the California Rails plan to improve, quote unquote, the rail performance. So frustrated that he wrote a 58-page paper outlining the vision for the Hyperloop method of rail transport. And you can see in the picture, it's a giant pneumatic tube. So imagine a 58-page paper, like a college physics paper, written by a billionaire CEO. That's what this vision was. And that unleashed billions of dollars of venture capital investing in Hyperloop systems all around the world. And it's a great example of the visionary vision. Habitat for Humanity is a great example of the inspiring vision. Their vision is imagine a world where everyone has a decent place to live. That's inspiring. It's clear. It's simple. Everyone has a decent place to live. And that vision has guided Habitat's focus on housing and has helped them avoid the classic nonprofit problem, which is to diversify into all kinds of tangential services that are outside your core competency. Housing is Habitat's one thing, and their vision is aligned with it. Southwest Airlines is a great example of what we call the ambition vision. Southwest Airlines, their vision statement has three components. Their vision is to become the most flown, most loved, and most profitable airline. And so you can see that their vision has three specific components. Each one of those is easily understandable and, in fact, measurable. So it's kind of like a SMART vision. It combines some of the thinking that you might see in a SMART goal with a long-term vision and puts them together. And it's a great example of what we call the ambition vision. And fourth, another great way to articulate a vision is as a BHAG. Perhaps some of you are familiar with that term from Jim Collins in his books, Good to Great and Built to Last. The BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. And for Mother Against Drunk Driving, their BHAG vision is zero. They can summarize their vision in one word. It also happens to be one number, 0. And that means 0 fatalities caused by drivers that are drunk or otherwise impaired. And this is a great way of articulating a vision. And so, how about your company? Do you have one and only one vision? One of the things we encountered that was very interesting was companies that had multiple visions. For example, each division had a different vision. And if your goal is to create alignment, we don't like that. So we advise companies to have one and only one vision. And then what kind of vision is it? Is it a visionary one, like Hyperloop? An inspiring one, like Habitat? Is it ambition, like Southwest? Or a BHAG, like MAD? And in a way, it doesn't really matter which one of those four you choose, but choose one, and it has to be clear, has to be compelling, and it has to be unifying so that it brings the whole company together. Because after all, what we're talking about is using your vision as a way to create alignment. Accelerator number 4 is one mission. And I must say, this was one of the more interesting and candidly problematic areas for us in our research. Because what we learned was that mission statements are kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of alignment. Some companies use them extremely effectively, and some companies didn't have one at all. And in many places, when I would ask about the mission statement, I'd get people like rolling their eyes. Oh, the mission statement. You know, a 3-sentence paragraph that nobody can understand or memorize or it doesn't do anything for us. But nonetheless, we included this as one of the accelerators because, as I said, we found exemplar companies that used the mission statement extremely effectively. For example, Tesla. Tesla's original mission statement was to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable transport. That was their original mission, and that guided them for many, many years. And then a few years ago, they bought Solar City, and they made a one-word change to their mission statement, which now reads, to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, not transport. But this is a great example of a mission statement. I read that, I know exactly what it means. And I know that that's Tesla's mission. I don't mistakenly read that and think, oh, that's Ford's mission, or that's General Motors' mission. I know it's uniquely Tesla's. Back to the one thing, because Tesla is clear about what their one thing is, and the mission statement is a great way of articulating that. So how about your company? Do you have one and only one mission? Again, we encountered companies that were fragmented. And as we unpacked that, what we discovered was that in many of these cases, every division had a different mission, every department had a different mission. There was no sense to which the mission statements cascaded or connected to the corporate one. And we looked at that and say, no wonder they're all fragmented and dysfunctional. And so, Henry, why don't I stop here and see if we have any questions so far on missions and visions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've had some good questions coming in. This one asks, so to reinforce alignment, how do you suggest measuring how the company is doing with respect to the one thing?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, once you have your one thing, you can identify a couple of measurements. One is we advise people to create one number that would track your performance relative to that. So, for example, Toyota and Lexus, their one thing is really quality. The relentless pursuit of perfection was the original Lexus tagline. And quality is a very measurable idea. And so not only can you have your one thing, but you can have a metric to guide your performance around that. The second thing that you can look at is what percentage of your budget is going towards your one thing. Back to Ferrari. Ferrari invests 15% of revenue in their one thing. Dyson, engineering is just part of the DNA, built in from day one. It starts with hiring and onboarding. They have the Dyson Fellows program that rewards engineers. They have a new program that they're using to educate new engineers and grow the engineering population. And so, I think once you clearly identify your one thing, you can start looking at a metric to measure it, number one, and number two, the allocation of resources, both financial and human capital, towards that.
Great. Here's another one. If a company is made up of several autonomous divisions, wouldn't separate one things, visions, missions potentially be important?
Maybe. Some companies operate as a company of companies. Let me give you two examples. Virgin and Berkshire Hathaway. So Virgin, they bought Hyperloop One, as you maybe picked up in the slide a few slides ago. So, but they have Virgin Records and Virgin Air and Virgin telecommunication services. And really what Virgin does is operate them like a company of companies. And the thing that glues them together is the Virgin brand. That's the only thing that's really absolutely positively non-negotiable amongst the Virgin companies. And so in that case, you will see different visions and missions and things in the Virgin companies. And that's similarly true in Berkshire Hathaway, that operates like a company of companies. But if your divisions are created just simply as a way of organizing your business, but you're really in one, similar business, and the divisions just allow you to, keep things organized. then I would recommend, to the extent possible, that you have one and only one vision, one and only one mission, especially if you believe that alignment is the ultimate competitive advantage, and alignment across the divisions is critical. As companies grow, they create divisions. There's only one problem, and that is that divisions, by definition, divide. And so if you're looking to create synergy across your divisions, I would recommend having one and only one vision, one mission, one set of values, one brand, probably.
Great. One more question. This person says, I struggle with vision versus mission. Do you have tips on distinguishing between the two? And then there's also a question about validating a vision.
Well, that's a great question. And what we learned is that, again, this was one of the trickier areas for us to package in the book, because some missions sounded like visions, some visions sounded like missions. The consulting reports that you read on, well, what's a mission statement versus a vision statement, seem to get them all confused. And so to me, a mission is a focus on what you're going to do. A vision is aspirational, forward-looking about what you want to become. But I would concede that other people spin that differently, which is why this vision mission thing, frankly, was, at one point in the book, we had it all together because, we were struggling to make that distinction ourselves. So I recognize the issue, and, I would say pick a way of doing it and stay with it. So let's, Henry, let's move on, and we'll queue up some more questions. I'll cover a couple more of the accelerators and we'll stop again. Accelerator number 5, one code. And this deals with values. Values are extremely important, but perhaps some of the audience on the webinar has experienced this, that many employees are cynical and jaded about them. I'm sorry to tell you that one of the CEOs we interviewed was unable to recite back his company's core values. Amazing. So no wonder employees are cynical and jaded. And if you want to have a little bit of fun after the webinar, of course, go over to despair.com and take a look at some of the posters that they created. The satirical, jaded, cynical view of values, like this one: perseverance, the courage to ignore the obvious wisdom of turning back. Or one of my favorites is mediocrity. It takes a lot less time, and most people won't notice until it's too late. But they've got a really fun selection of these kind of pithy, satirical posters on values. But what we learned is that, again, many companies use their values extremely effectively. For example, Hilton. When Christopher Nassetta took over as the CEO of Hilton, there were 30 different lists of core values. Each Hilton sub-brand had their own list. Nassetta decided that that was unacceptable, that they wanted to create alignment across the Hilton brands. And so they went through an exercise that took them about a year to create one list of values that was then universally applied in all of Hilton. And it's an acrostic that spells out the word Hilton. H is for hospitality, and you can imagine the rest of them. And so this is a great example of a company that was highly fragmented, that went through a realignment exercise by locking down one and only one list of core values. In Hilton, it's 6 words and 6 sentences. Another fascinating example is Netflix. The reason we call this one code is we really like the way Netflix articulated their culture code. It goes way beyond the standard list of 3, 5, or 7 core values. It was originally published as 127 PowerPoint slides that articulated not just who they were, what they valued, and specifically how they expected people to behave. And it's that last piece which is critically important, because after all, it's one thing to have a set of words on posters or on coffee mugs. It's a whole nother thing for those words to guide employees' behaviors. And so I strongly encourage you, if you haven't done so, look up the Netflix Culture Code. Now it's just a big, long page on their website, and you can go look at it. I think it's on their careers page. But look at it. It's fascinating and uniquely theirs, which is why we like this idea of calling it one code. So think about your company. Do you have one and only one list of core values? Like Hilton, do you have perhaps multiple lists and you decide you want to integrate them? For example, the United States military, the Department of Defense, has a list of core values. So do each of the service branches. The Navy and the Marines, in fact, have the same list of values, but they describe them differently. The Army has a different list. The Coast Guard has a different list. The Air Force has a different list still. That works for them. But in general, we prefer to see a company with one and only one list of values. And then the second bullet, that's the most important thing. What do you do to make them more than just words on the posters? Because we know that people are cynical. So for example, we were interacting with one company and they had an executive whose behaviors were clearly and blatantly out of alignment with the company's values. Clearly, blatantly, volitionally out of alignment with the values. So we asked the CEO, well, why don't you fire that guy? And the answer was, he's making his numbers. So what that told us immediately was that profitability was more important than the values that they espoused and claimed to believe in. And so if you're struggling with this cynical, jaded culture about values, I would strongly encourage you to think about, are they more than just words on the posters? Number 6, one brand. What we learned is that you have to align everyone and everything to deliver your brand promise. It's not just your mission and your vision and your values. Those are important, perhaps necessary, but certainly not sufficient. For example, Geico. You already know the brand promise at Geico. They've been using the same 15 minutes will save you 15% on your car insurance for 17 years, the same exact brand promise. It's crystal clear. I know exactly what it is, and they've stayed relentlessly with it. And so this is a great example of a company with a clear brand promise, that they use that brand promise to create alignment. So how about your company? Do you have a clear and compelling corporate brand promise? Does everybody know what it is? Because the people in your company are the personification of your brand. They're the personification of your brand. And in order for them to deliver the brand promise, they need to know what it is. Unfortunately, the chief marketing officer position tends to really churn in most companies, which creates this dynamic of a constant redo of the brand promise, the tagline constantly gets redone by the new CMO. We advise companies to pick a brand promise and stay with it, like Geico, like Chick-fil-A, or even more impressively, like De Beers. A diamond is forever. They've been using that literally forever. So let's, Henry, let me stop there and check back in and see if we have some more questions before we go on.
Sure. So this one asks, in an aligned company, how are employees able to see over time whether they're contributing or not? And should that focus be around the one thing or company profitability?
Well, that's probably, that's a great question. We're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of the presentation, where we talk about aligning everyone. But in terms of is it your one thing or is it profitability? It's probably both, right? So when we have to help employees become great at that company's one thing, and but profitability is important too. Companies have shareholders that expect a return, and it's both. But we'll talk a little bit about what the best companies do to engage everyone and ensure that everyone's to-do list is connected with the strategic plan in a few slides ahead. Mm-hmm. You have another one for me?
Yeah, well, this one asks, Hyperloop may have been visionary, but it's economically a disaster. So how do you suggest validating a vision?
All right, so so this is a very interesting question. Obviously, an astute follower of Hyperloop and the Hyperloop systems, and the really it's a swing for the fences, complete restructuring of the global transportation network. And so I think certainly, perhaps so far, there have been financial difficulties, but it was still a visionary vision. Not all visions are executed well, right? So having the vision is great, but you have to execute on that. And profitability is a byproduct of great execution. So, but it's a great question, very astute observer, obviously, on that one. Let's talk about strategy. Strategy is one of those words. If you look at McKinsey or the Boston Consulting Group or Bain or Strategy or any of the big consulting firms, you'll find that they don't have a common definition of what the word strategy actually means. And so rather than propose a new framework or something else, we took this approach. We said your strategy has to be able to answer questions for people, and we picked 5 of them that you have to answer clearly and precisely. Who? That's who's the customer? Who's the target market that we're going after? For USAA, it's the military. They're intensely focused on members of the military, retired members of the military, and their families. That's their target market. They know more about that target market than anybody because they're intensely focused on it. And it's very clear who their who is. Everybody at USAA knows who's the customer and which markets are we going to go after and which markets are we not going to go after. Because in fact, if you try to buy insurance or financial products from USAA and you don't have a military connection, they won't sell it to you. The answer will be no. The what? What does your product sell? What products and or services do you sell? Basecamp is a fascinating example of this. Perhaps some of you use Basecamp as a project management system in your companies. But at one point, the company was called 37 Signals, and they made all kinds of products beyond Basecamp. And they had expanded into CRM and into all types of other applications. And then Jason Fried, at an offsite meeting, challenged his team this way. He said, most of the time, we're talking about doing more. But I want us to think about doing less. And in fact, that offsite meeting was a catalyst for Basecamp exiting all the other businesses so they could focus on one product and, in fact, change the name of the company from 37 Signals to Basecamp. So obviously, if your company is a one-product company, it's a lot easier to create alignment. But if you're going to be in multiple products, if you're going to sell multiple services, you have to be able to articulate which ones are you going to sell and which ones are you not going to sell as part of your strategy. The third question you need to answer is, where do we compete? For Iridium, this is a global telecommunications company. Their where is summarized in their tagline, which is everywhere. Iridium is a global satellite provider that sells services to like maritime and other applications where they need global coverage. But for your company, you might operate in one zip code or one city or one state or one country or maybe in North America. But this is a strategy question that you have to answer. Where do you operate and where do you not operate? And everybody in the company needs to know what that is. How much do you charge? Dollar Tree has built a $20 billion company selling things for $1. Matter of fact, their founder, their late founder, wrote a book called $1 at a Time. But you have to decide, are you Dollar Tree or are you Neiman Marcus? You can't be both. So as part of your strategy, in order to create strategic alignment, we suggest that companies answer the how much question. Where are we in the price point continuum? Are we Dollar Tree, Neiman Marcus, somewhere in the middle? Where are we? And last but not least, you have to answer the question of how. In other words, how do you make money? What's your business model? Tom's is famous for the one-for-one business model. Buy a pair of shoes and we'll give another pair away. And they use that same business model for eyewear and the other services that they ended up providing. But their one-for-one business model describes how they make money. So when it comes to creating strategy alignment, we advise companies at least get these 5 questions answered clearly and precisely so that everybody knows who's the customer, what do we sell, where do we operate, how much do we charge, and how do we make money. And if everybody in your company can answer those 5 questions, you're probably on your way to having strategic alignment. Accelerator number 8, one portfolio. What we learned is customers love products that are integrated into a tightly aligned and integrated portfolio. So back to the Basecamp example. That's a one product company. And so this is kind of not that important for them. But most companies try to sell multiple products and services. And a great way to create alignment is to integrate them into a portfolio. For example, Lego. I was home at my parents' house a couple of months ago and my mom was cleaning up the Legos that my brothers and I played with when we were kids, 50 years ago. And these Legos are still compatible with the Legos that you can buy today, fully compatible. And they work still beautifully. And so Lego is a great example of a company that has all kinds of products, but they have a unifying product architecture that creates alignment. Another interesting one is Ryobi. Ryobi makes tools. And about 20 years ago, Ryobi launched a line of cordless tools called the One System. And they made a commitment at that point that they would never change the battery. Never change the battery. And so now, if you go to your local Home Depot, you'll see this incredible portfolio of Ryobi tools, blowers and saws and drills, and even wireless speakers that float in your pool, powered off of the same battery. But they made a commitment that they would never change the battery. Now, let me contrast that with Apple. I don't know about you, but I've got an entire drawer full of Apple power cords and other accessories that are no longer compatible with what I'm using now. Entire landfills have been filled with Apple trash. Imagine if Apple had said, we're never changing the power cord. The same power cord that charges your iMac will charge your MacBook Air, it'll charge your phone, it'll charge your iPad, it'll charge your iPod, charge the whole line. Imagine. Obviously, they didn't do that, but I wish they had. So how about your company? Do you have a unifying product architecture that glues your products together and creates product alignment? Like Ryobi, is there one component of your product design that you're going to commit to your customers that will never change? These are incredibly powerful ways to create alignment, and again, way beyond the typical mission, vision, values kind of thinking. Let me take one more, Henry, and we'll have some questions. Accelerator 9, one way. One way. Here's what we learned. That companies have to identify, optimize, and then institutionalize your mission-critical processes. These is your one way. There's one and only one way of doing something at your company. And obviously, you have to identify which processes are critical to standardize that way. Because you don't want to standardize everything, because that would be stifling, but you have to standardize and institutionalize some things. For example, Starbucks. My go-to drink is a double tall skim latte. I have ordered that in hundreds of Starbucks around the world. And there's only one way to make it. You know, there's always over 100,000 permutations of Starbucks drinks when you factor in all the different sizes and decafs and all the other ways you can tweak your drink. But for each one of those, there's only one way to do it. And these are specifically outlined in the Starbucks beverage manuals, and it's the Starbucks way. And what we found is that in great high performance, highly aligned companies, there was clarity about which are the processes that have to be standardized as their one way. And we found this a lot, this exact language, like the McKinsey way, the Starbucks way, the Bognet construction way, and it articulated how we do things. And so it's critical for companies to say which things are absolutely positively standardized and institutionalized as part of your process and part of what you do. And so, Henry, let's take a quick break again and see if you have any questions about the strategy or the portfolio or your one way or anything else we've covered so far.
Sure. So one question is, are the order of these, is it anything in terms of decreasing priority, or is it chronologically you would recommend going through 1 through 12, making sure that you check them off as you go down the list, or are the numbers just arbitrarily assigned?
Well, there's some logic to it. Obviously, when you're putting a book together, you're putting the chapters and you're reordering them and trying to get it just right. But certainly, there's logic with number 1, starting with one team. It starts at the top. A misaligned executive team will never create an aligned company. Number 2, the reason we put one thing right behind that is that we found many companies that had missions and visions and values, but they were still totally fouled up. Well, why? In my judgment, it's because they never had clarity about what their one thing was. And so that's why we say to companies, lock down your one thing before you write your vision or your mission or your values or your brand promise or develop your strategy. So that's why we put it first. That's why I wrote a book about that whole subject. And again, reiterate my offer. If you like a copy, happy to send you one. But last but not least, we're going to talk about aligning everyone. And so there's some logic to it, but yeah. And what I would say is this: what we advise companies to go through is look at all 12, rank them in terms of your performance along that dimension of alignment and the urgency or importance of fixing it or improving it. And what we might learn is that, your mission and vision are kind of fine, but what we need to lock down for your company is your one way. The real problem is the processes, and that's the problem. So, we use this as a first pass. Let's go through and then prioritize where to invest your alignment energy.
Great. Can you quickly go back to the checkpoint question for one portfolio? Someone wanted to see it again.
Sure. There you go. So a unifying product architecture, that's like Lego. And a component of your product design that will never change, that's like Ryobi. And is there another question perhaps, Henry, in there?
I think they just wanted to see it again and capture it. But we'll also send out the presentation afterwards, and if people want to go back and look at things, they certainly can.
Yeah. Yes. You're recording this, right, Henry?
Yep.
So it'll be on the website, and I have a one-page handout with these 12 accelerators for you that Henry will send after the webinar. So let's zip along. Okay, let's talk about your customer experience. This is another great way to create alignment, is that you develop and deliver a standardized customer experience that makes customers say, wow. And you decide that that's how you're going to create alignment. For example, Costco. I've been a Costco member for, 25 years. I've been to dozens of Costcos, and they all have virtually identical customer experiences. You show up, you grab your cart, you have to show them your Costco ID. You can't get in without it. That is kind of like a membership in an exclusive club, like the world's most savvy shoppers, because you've got a Costco wholesale card in your wallet. That gets you in. The average grocery store carries 300,000 products. The average Costco carries 4,000. There's no carpeting. There's not many sales associates. There's not like Nordstrom's people running around helping you, a bunch of metal shelves and products with amazing prices. And, you go in there for a toaster and you end up with buying a 72-inch high-definition television because it was just too good a deal to pass up. But Costco has standardized the customer experience, and every Costco does it virtually identical around the world. And it's a great way to create alignment. And so your company, do you have a customer experience? Is it standardized? Does it make people say, wow? Obviously you don't want to just have a customer experience. You want customers to say, wow, I'm going back to Costco next time I need something. One plan, and we'll finish the last couple, Henry, and then we'll open up for questions again. One plan. So what we learned is that fast lane companies have dynamic planning and strategy management systems. Earlier, there was a question about this subject, and here's the way we think of it. Imagine that we need to connect the corporate strategic plan to everyone's to-do list. Connect the strategic plan to everyone's to-do list. Because if you don't do that, well-meaning people come to work every day and they do the wrong thing. They didn't mean to do the wrong thing, but the corporate strategy and plan and goals and priorities weren't clear, or they weren't effectively cascaded. So the example of our company here is Hagerty. Hagerty is primarily known as an insurer of classic cars. And Hagerty happens to be an Align Today customer. And they use the Align software to create this kind of dynamic alignment at scale. It's a very rapidly growing company. When McKeel Hagerty took over as CEO 20 years ago, there was like 50 employees. Now there's like 1,100 and more. And they've diversified into a couple of different businesses. They're in multiple locations. And the Align software allows them to implement the Rockefeller habits at scale. So there's the one-page plan, which is in the software for everyone to see. There's no sense that the strategic plan is in a 3-ring binder on somebody's shelf. Everybody can see it. It's 1 page long, so everybody can understand it. It's not 500 PowerPoint slides. They also use the system to connect the dots to create goal alignment. And they use the software to help document check-ins and one-on-one meetings. And so this is one of the big breakthroughs, in my judgment, in creating alignment. Because think about how we used to do this. There'd be the strategic planning department. They'd go off and do a strategic plan. It would typically be a big deck of PowerPoint slides. Maybe 50 people had that deck of slides in their shelf. And then individual employees' goals were probably written on paper or typed in Microsoft Word documents that ended up being locked up in HR because they were confidential. And so the big breakthrough, I think, is the tools like Align that create the sense of goal transparency, goal alignment. Everybody can see what everybody else is working on. And we strongly recommend that companies take advantage of this new technology to improve alignment and to connect the dots between the corporate strategic plan, the corporate priorities, and everybody's to-do list. And so, how does your company do that? Because, the bigger you are, the harder this is. The more divisions you have, the harder this is. The more locations you have, the harder this is. And once you go global, you got multiple currencies and languages and all kinds of other things creating additional complexity. So, this is the best companies do this. And I probably could have written a whole book just about this one chapter. And last but not least, let's talk about connecting the dots down to everyone. Alignment starts with one team. That was the accelerator number 1, but you must align everyone, okay? And so, fascinating case of Cirque du Soleil. The question we looked at there is, how do you align a bunch of clowns? And my hunch is that some of you on the phone, you're like, hey, Dave's reading my mind. I'm trying to align a bunch of clowns at my company too, but I'm not in the circus business. But what Cirque du Soleil does is they have Cirque du Soleil 101. It's a 3-month intense onboarding experience where all the new performers from around the world go to Montreal to get, if you will, indoctrinated into the Cirque du Soleil culture, the Cirque du Soleil way, learn their role in the show, meet all their fellow performers before hitting the road. It's a 3-month onboarding experience. Most companies, they just hire and hope. Your onboarding consists of filling out some forms and maybe you get a couple of things with the core values and that's it. The best companies go way beyond that. And Cirque du Soleil is a fascinating example of what they do for their onboarding and Cirque du Soleil 101. Another thing we looked at that we spent a lot of time on was the impact of the corporate structure and specifically how shares were allocated on alignment. And Publix is the world's largest employee stock-owned company, ESOP. And they've been an ESOP for like 50 years. And the idea is this: if we want everyone to think and act like an owner, then we need to make them owners. And so they created an ESOP. So there's not different classes of shares like there is at Facebook, for example, where Mark Zuckerberg has the majority of the voting rights. And many companies have different share classes of shares, A shares, B shares, with different rights and different, well, all of that does was create misalignment in the ownership interest. So, we say, let's look at your corporate structure and your ownership structure, and is that enhancing or impeding alignment? And I'll stop with this one. Simplexity is a small product design and development company based in the Midwest, in the West Coast. And this is fascinating. Virtually every company, perhaps all of your companies, have a bonus at the end of the year. What Simplexity does is they calculate the total bonus pool based on corporate profitability, like most companies. And then they divide that bonus pool equally so that every employee gets exactly the same bonus. It's not like the CEO gets a $10 million bonus and the junior person gets a $100 bonus. Everybody gets exactly the same dollar amount. And Dorada Shortell had a fascinating explanation for the reason she did that was she wanted to create alignment on her team. And she felt that compensation was like the third rail of alignment. All kinds of misalignment gets created by misaligned compensation plans. And I found this particular case study to be fascinating. So think about your company, what are you doing to get everybody aligned? Are you focused on employee engagement, which is good, or employee alignment, which is better? So those are the 12. As I mentioned, Henry, I encourage people to think of this like a checklist. Go through and red, yellow, green them. Which are the ones that need more attention, and which are the ones that they're good at. And with that, perhaps, Henry, let's open up for some more questions.
Sure. So this one asks, for everyone, we just created a new hire orientation program, but do you have tips on taking the next steps for creating a learning and development program, career pathing, employee engagement, etc.?
Yeah, all of the talent management disciplines in that accelerator number 12, everyone need to come into play here. Okay, and it's all the ones that whoever asked the question raised. Everything from hiring, because we want to hire people that are already aligned with our values before we ever meet with them. Okay, interviewing, onboarding, job placement, job fit evaluation, ongoing training. One of the things we're big fans of is the weekly one-on-one meetings. And we saw a lot of exemplar companies not only using one-on-one meetings, but using software such as Align or others to ensure that those one-on-one meetings were happening, that the action items in the conversations were documented, and then we could have the corporate HR people do the analytics to make sure that they're actually doing it. Because it's easy to say, oh yeah, we're doing one-on-ones, but then we didn't. So all of those talent management disciplines come into play And again, that's probably a whole nother book I could write right there about applying those to create alignment, because alignment is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing thing. So let me show you this video. Maybe some of you have seen this, but it's a great example of how companies can start out aligned, so far so good, some treacherous terrain, and then, no, that's not, that's going to hurt. And then, and then it starts out as a little bit of misalignment, and then, that the company's all fouled up, and yeah, look at that. That's going to hurt. That's not good. And oh no, it's even worse. And oh, look, there's thousands of them still coming. So a small misalignment can cascade into, a tremendous dysfunction in a company. And it's very easy for companies to start out aligned, and they hit a pothole, and all of a sudden things are all fouled up, kind of like that video. So I'm happy to stay, Henry, for as long as there's questions, and answer others that, or anybody wants to go, or we'll do with them via email or whatever.
All right, I think we're all set. Dave, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to everyone for attending. I'll send out a follow-up after this with the recording and the handout that Dave talked about. Would love to, accept any feedback, suggestions, things people would like to see in future sessions, things they found particularly helpful. But Dave, it's been great to have you for these, and a lot of super valuable stuff, I think, for all sorts of different companies. So we really thank you for your time, and look forward to.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks to the Align team, and thanks to all the participants. And there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me directly if there's anything I can do to be helpful or answer any questions that you want to hit me individually with. So thanks again.